Hello and welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast. My name is Stephen Cole, and today I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Jamie Ingram. Jamie is the editor of the Middle East Economic Survey. The survey is a very well-known and highly respected weekly publication of analysis and editorial content covering energy, economic and political developments across the Middle East and North Africa region, focusing on oil and gas markets, energy policy, investment, geopolitical developments. And we're going to be having a look at some of those issues, hopefully all of those issues, in the time allowed on this podcast. So, Jamie, a very warm welcome to the Al-Attiyah podcast.
Good morning, Stephen. It's a pleasure to join you today. It's always great to speak to august representatives of the media like you and, the Al-Attiyah Foundation. Really appreciate a lot of the output that you guys have on the podcast and some of the reports that you put out. Very, very prestigious organization, and it's a real pleasure to join you today. Look forward to an interesting conversation.
Jamie, you're most kind. First of all, how did you first become involved in energy journalism? So what led you then to join the Middle East Economic Survey?
Sure. Well, do you know what? Actually, the Middle East Economic Survey was my first foray into energy journalism. Beforehand, I was covering a lot of the same issues, but with the analyst hat, as it were. So interesting to jump ships across into journalism, but really the parallels between the two tracks, are considerable. So I've been with MEES now for very nearly 10 years. I was approached by the former editor at the time, James Cockayne, who asked me if I'd be interested in joining MEES, and almost immediately my answer was yes. In my previous role as an analyst with what was at the time known as IHS, a prominent energy consultancy, now part of S&P, we received a number of energy-focused publications, and I can honestly say that MEES was always the go-to read for me and a lot of my colleagues. So it really was a short conversation as to do I want to join MEES.
Well, that's a great qualification, because everybody in the world is searching for truth, and to move from analysis to journalism is a great move. What are your key responsibilities as editor?
Well, I've actually just recently taken on the role of managing editor at MEES. I've been in the role for about 2 months now. I was previously, a part of the senior leadership team for the best part of 10 years. But it's an interesting question to ask now at this particular time, because taking on the role it's a great opportunity to take a step back, to have a look at what MEES is doing now, what we have been doing, and whether, with this new start, there are any things that we can do differently, and also any particular issues that we previously haven't been comfortable covering for any particular reason, or just haven't got around to covering. There's a bit of a gap in in the work that we put out there. So it's a really interesting time to look and see what can be done differently at MEES. In terms of my key responsibilities, the reason that I joined MEES is because I love the writing side of things. So I'm trying to keep a hold of that as much as possible. But clearly, being editor comes with a lot of responsibilities to make sure that the publication as a whole kind of really, really hums. I see the primary thing really is to make sure that every week we put out a coherent and comprehensive issue, where the articles, they're not just standalone pieces. They align with each other. I love to have references between the different articles, and also they fit in with the back catalogue of MEES going back as far as 1957. It's always a real delight when we can start to pull out some little bits of obscure information that go back decades. I think that's a real value add that we can put there to really put things into context.
Well, you've basically explained how your role has changed, especially as editor-in-chief, because you're going to be looking now increasing the big picture.
Absolutely.
What the survey is offering, because it is a time of change, especially the economics of MENA has changed so much over the years. So is that a priority?
It absolutely is. So it was the OPEC International Seminar in Vienna last week. And Saudi Arabia's energy minister, Prince Abdulaziz Al Saud, he was very bullish when it comes to some of the issues within the kingdom when it pertains to the energy transition. And I'm not talking about forecasts for oil demand going forward in the decades or anything like that. I'm talking about what his comments were regarding the role of solar, the role of wind within Saudi Arabia. And I thought it was a very interesting comments that aligned with some of his previous statements as well, where he said that Saudi Arabia can be the real winner from the energy transition here. I mean, if we look at I think it is one of the lesser spoken about issues within the region, really. It's just how well suited many of the Middle East countries are when it comes to solar. They have large tracts of land. They obviously, everybody knows about the sunshine that is there. So you have the cheapest solar in the world in Saudi Arabia. So what's interesting here is that it undercuts gas as a price for power generation, but it frees up oil and gas that's currently used for electricity generation within these countries to be redirected into more value accretive areas, whether that's just exporting onto global markets or using as feedstock for petrochemicals facilities. So I think that's one of the fascinating economic trends in the region.
Well, is this going to be the trend, the main hurdle for you to sort of balance the green agenda against the fossil fuel agenda?
I mean, definitely balancing these huge changes is huge. Yes, absolutely. I would say that even when I joined 10 years ago, if people asked, what do you write about? It would have been overwhelmingly oil and gas. Nowadays, it's a much more balanced set of issues that we do touch upon. I frequently do find myself writing about solar, about wind. For certainly, 5 years ago, there was the start of huge hype over low carbon hydrogen. That started to fizzle out a little bit, but you do have to keep your finger on the pulse of what emerging energy sources there are. And of course, if countries are starting to try and diversify their economies away from energy in particular, then you have to look a little bit further down into the industrial layers as well. So looking at, to take some examples, Abu Dhabi's trying to develop green steel production, green aluminium production to be able to supply low carbon products into the global economy outside of just energy.
Interesting. MEES has been around for almost as long as me. So what distinguishes MEES from other publications in the MENA region?
That's an important question, Stephen. Thanks. I think that the key distinguishing feature for us is that we are a weekly publication, and we have the scope for long form articles. So that gives us the opportunity. A news story breaks, instead of trying to rush out and beat everybody else to covering the story, we have the opportunity to sit back and really digest and think, first off, is this actually important? But secondly, why is it important? What are the implications of this? We have time to digest it, put something together that really stands out from the pack, because it does try and put everything into the context to tell the greater story, really, as opposed to trying to rush out there and get the headline. And I think one thing in the sector that's really changing is that people can be overwhelmed with news and with information now. There's so much information out there on social media, on new and emerging publications, but it's not always very reliable, and you can get overwhelmed and confused by the sheer amount of information that's out there. I genuinely think that entities like MEES perform an important value, because you can rely on us to say, this is actually important, this isn't important. We can separate the wheat from the chaff.
And you would know well, because of your background in analysis. Journalism is always competitive. Magazines, surveys, newspapers, television. Do you rely on scoops, or do you think your readers prefer steady, reliable journalism? Probably both, I suspect. Can you share a memorable story or major scoop that you broke?
Yeah, absolutely. The scoops, they always, you do get a bit of a rush when you get something like that, when you get a story that nobody else has.
Too right. I remember.
And clearly, it generate, if you're lucky, it can generate headlines in other publications as well. So I think that it does add value, and it does, quite frankly, serve as a good marketing tool, because those are the things that gets MEES's name out there more. But I think that the bedrock of what we do is providing the detailed analysis on stories, whether we're the ones that broke them or not. In terms of some of the scoops that we've had, we've had things like the Zohr gas field offshore Egypt, a corner piece of Egypt's energy sector has had a number of troubles in recent years. We were the ones that first broke that production capacity was declining there with some water issues. We had Qatar Energy farming into a huge multi-billion-dollar project with Total Energies in Iraq, and also more recently ADNOC's international arm XRG entering Turkmenistan. We were the ones that broke that they were that they'd set up a company to facilitate that entry. So
Interesting.
yeah, we do have the scoops, but I think that the predominant area that we really add the value in is on adding the analysis, adding those extra layers on top of the stories.
You briefly mentioned Saudi and OPEC.
Mm-hmm.
What is your take on the OPEC and the decision-making dynamics, especially considering the intergroup tensions?
Well, of course, now we have to talk about OPEC Plus, not just OPEC. That's one of the the big changes that has taken place since I joined MEES in 2015. And it has, people often talk about OPEC as if it is this entity that's always existed in its current form, but OPEC has changed over the years all the time. You can really point to it being very very different entities throughout its history. I think that now at the moment, the power that you get within OPEC and OPEC Plus has always come from your spare capacity. And there are very few countries within OPEC and OPEC Plus that have significant levels of spare capacity now. And so that has led to a more centralized decision-making process, I would say. Whereas beforehand, you used to have more discrete, not power centers that might have, some of them would be pushing price more, some of them would be pushing market share more. But now the real decision-making process lies within the Gulf states, within the GCC, within Saudi Arabia, the UAE, to a lesser extent Kuwait, really. So it's a very tight-knit group. And of course, technology has also had a huge impact on it. I mean, OPEC and OPEC Plus has changed enormously as a result of COVID. They used to always meet in Vienna twice a year for lengthy in-person talks. Now they had to go digital because of COVID, and they're not having the in-person talks as frequently, but they are having just constant dialogue between each other outside of the meetings on WhatsApp, on Zoom, on all these platforms to make sure that the narrative is there. So often people talk about, oh, this was a very quick meeting. Well, not necessarily. They've been talking for days in the run-up to it. The meeting itself was just a rubber stamp after they'd already hashed out the difficult areas beforehand.
It is ironic, isn't it, that COVID was such a blow around the world, did so much damage, but it has opened up channels of communication, especially Zoom, Teams, etc. But I wonder, how brave are you, Jamie? What is your editorial approach covering controversial or, of course, politically sensitive areas? And how do you ensure your accuracy and neutrality of your reporting?
I think the key word that you said there is accuracy. Clearly, especially for a publication like us, where we rely on our analytical credentials, accuracy is paramount. But when you're covering sensitive issues, you really need to double check everything, not just to make sure that you're accurate, but to make sure that you can show your workings if challenged on this, because you're talking about sensitive issues that are of paramount national security, economic importance for the countries that you are writing about here. So if it's news that they are not particularly happy with getting out into the public domain, they might come back at you. So the ability to say, this is exactly why we wrote this, and we are willing to defend our methodology, that's the most important thing, I think. So really the ability to cover sensitive topics comes down to having those foundations in place, that you've got information that you can not just rely on, but that you can prove that it's reliable.
I mean, we talked very briefly about COVID and the change in communication tools. Can you describe the collaboration between analysts, journalists, contributors within MEES? And I wonder how digital tools, AI and data visualization, has changed how MEES tells your stories.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Stephen. clearly that there is a network of analysts and journalists out there, and we run ideas past each other, and there's always a risk with that. I think it's definitely worth flagging up. There's always a risk of groupthink when you have these informal networks that are out there, but I think that the value that comes from this outweighs the risk of groupthink, as long as you're aware that it is something to be tackled. So we do speak to analysts because often they have they often have information that isn't out there in the public domain, and also they are studying these issues often even in more depth than we're able to, and so they can just have interesting ideas about the importance of certain developments that we might not have in-house. But when it comes to new technological tools, for us, we see data as a core part of our offering. So the data visualization is very important. I would say that one of the big developments in recent years for us is internal mapping software and satellite imagery, because when you're talking about project developments, let's take solar in the Gulf, for instance. These are huge developments. If you're talking about a 2 gigawatt solar facility that spans kilometers, it's literally visible from space. And so when somebody says this solar plant's going to start up in 2 months' time, you can quickly get on satellite imagery and say, no, that solar plant is not going to start up in 2 months' time. I'm very sorry to tell you this, but that time frame is wrong. And likewise,
what an amazing tool, Jerry. Sorry to interrupt you. But...
Yeah, likewise in terms of conflict times as well. So there was obviously very recently the conflict between Iran and Israel. You had eyes in the sky where you can see the extent of any damage. The Israelis did strike a gas facility in Iran. We were able to see the extent of the damage from satellite imagery. It's
really,
it is an amazing tool.
Gosh, so that's really exclusive, isn't it? Using a tool.
A lot of it is you can have access out there for free. That's one of the huge transformative issues of the last decade, I would say, is that it's gone from being this incredibly expensive tool that you have to book days in advance with private companies to something that you can get a free login.
Well, I mean, as well as having the eye in the sky, a successful editor needs a crystal ball. So considering that, where do you see oil prices and demand heading in the next 5 years, especially with the global transition pressures? And what other key topics will MEES be tracking in the next couple of years?
Well, we always try to keep our crystal ball firmly locked in the cupboard when it comes to oil prices. It's a great way to end up with the egg on your face to try and forecast that. But what I would say is that the level of uncertainty in the short and medium term when it comes to oil market balances is greater than anything that I can recall at the moment. The sheer disparity between assessments from major organizations such as the IEA and OPEC on where global demand and where global non-OPEC supply is coming from is absolutely phenomenal. So if you look at one report for next year, even for this year, frankly, you can come away thinking the world is awash with oil. You read another report, say, oh, hang on, everybody's incredibly short on oil. So yeah, but I feel sorry for people who are trying to predict oil prices at the moment, because from a month to month, let alone a year to year basis, it is incredible. Generally, the trajectory, especially in real terms, when you factor in inflation, is somewhat bearish. There's limited expectations of oil getting back to $100 anytime soon. But yeah, trying to guess oil prices now, that's something that I will gracefully bow out of.
Okay, well, I'll just come up with one last question briefly. What energy or geopolitical development in MENA do you think is underreported or misunderstood at the moment? And are you helping to make a correction?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I sorry to repeat myself, but I have to direct back to renewables within the Gulf states, really. I think that's a key issue, not just when it comes to the economic diversification, but simply when it comes to the amount of oil that this can free up. If you look at Saudi Arabia alone, it burns more than 1 million barrels a day of oil on average over the course of a year. for its power sector because it's short on gas. By 2030, they intend to have a 50-50 balance between gas and renewables. So if you can imagine Saudi Arabia, 1 million barrels a day is almost equivalent to 1% of global oil demand at the moment. Wow. And by 2030, Saudi Arabia might be adding that to the global market, not from additional production, but simply from not consuming it domestically. So that's a huge, huge issue. But, to move a little bit further out of that, I think that energy interconnections between the Middle East and neighboring areas is something that is going to become an increasingly prominent issue going forward. There is considerable scope in North Africa, let's say, for clean energy generation, and it is in close proximity to European states which are looking to electrify their economies even further. So the scope for sending green generated energy molecules across into Southern Europe is considerable. I know it is an issue that faces hurdles. There was a very high-profile plan to send, I think it was as much as 5 gigawatts possibly from Morocco to the UK, which the UK government cancelled a couple of weeks ago. It was a very pioneering, difficult project, so that's understandable. But I think that we'll see smaller scale issues with that between North African states and the likes of Spain and Italy going forward. There's been a long trade between them in terms of sending gas by pipeline. I think we could be shifting more to electrons in the near future.
Jamie, that was my last question. So may I, on behalf of the Al-Attiyah Foundation, thank you so much for chatting to me today and providing our listeners with such valuable insights on the energy industry. A great deal of what you said I had no idea about. That it's really good to have talked to you. Hopefully you'll keep getting those scoops and leading energy journalism.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's a real pleasure to speak to you this morning, and I look forward to following you and the Al-Attiyah Foundation's output in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, thank you for listening. There'll be a new Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast, Jamie, released in the coming weeks. So be sure to follow us on YouTube, X, formerly Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram to get the Foundation's latest publications and news. In the meantime, until the next time, from myself and from Jamie, goodbye.